You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean remembering itself in human form. Anonymous. Close your eyes. Let the noise fade. Listen. Beneath the crash and hiss of the tide, there's a second voice. Not in your ears, behind your heart, a hum that feels older than the waves themselves. Some people hear it only once, standing alone on a midnight beach, horizon swallowing the stars. Others feel it in the between, those thin places right after waking, right before sleep, when the mind is quiet enough to notice what the soul has never stopped hearing. It's a call, not to go somewhere new, but to remember somewhere ancient. If you've ever stood at the shoreline and felt an ache you couldn't name, if you've ever looked into the Pacific and thought, I've been here before, if the rhythm of waves makes more sense than the rhythm of modern life, then you already know this pull. It isn't nostalgia. It isn't a postcard memory. It's deeper, older. There is a word the world uses, Lemuria, but long before we gave it a name, some simply called it the first shore. When I say home, I don't mean an address. I mean a frequency, a state of being where humans moved like currents inside a living ocean, where technology meant light, breath, and intention, where the loudest messages were sent in silence, feeling to feeling, heart to heart. Call it a land if you like, but to the ones who remember, Lemuria was and is a living consciousness, a shared dream the earth had with us. Modern science maps the sea with sonar and sensors. The Lemurians listened for tones. Some tones you hear, surf thundering on rock, the cavern boom of a hollow wave. Others you feel, a vibration under the ribs as if the water speaks in the marrow. They believe the ocean carries memory of birth, of change, of everything that was and will be. That ache you feel at the edge of the tide, it might not be longing, it might be recognition. On a wind-brushed stretch of the Northern California coast, a woman named Elena, a nurse from Oakland, sat alone after a 12-hour shift. She hadn't planned on stopping. She just drove until the city lights were behind her. She kicked off her shoes, pressed her feet into the cold sand, let the tide reach for her toes. I felt watched, she would say later, but not in a bad way, like the ocean knew my name. A wave pulled back, and the wet sand became a mirror. Sky and sea traded places. For one breath, she could not tell which world she stood in. Then it came, a low tone, not in her ears, but in her chest, as if the water found a string inside her and plucked it once. She remembered things she'd never lived. Hands over a bowl of water bright as starlight. Voices singing without words. Buildings that rose like crystal grown from the ground, glowing with the same rhythm as her pulse. It lasted a heartbeat, maybe two. Then the world was ordinary again. Fire popping, wind cutting sideways, her car alone on the turnout. Elena laughed, then she cried. She said nothing changed and everything did. She didn't quit her job. She didn't run away. She just started listening for that tone beneath the noise. And when the ward filled with panic and alarms, she found she could feel the people in her care, not just their charts, but their fear. And listen, not with your ears, with your heart. Because if you feel it, that pulse beneath the tide, you'll know the journey home has already begun. The ocean isn't the only water that remembers. Hundreds of miles from any coastline, there's a small lake in Minnesota where the water lies still enough to hold the clouds without breaking them. A dock extends from a bank of reeds, its planks sun-bleached and warm under bare feet. You sit at the end of that dock. No tide here, no crash of waves, just the smallest lap against the wood. The air smells of cedar and algae. Close your eyes. Count 3 breaths in silence. On the next inhale, imagine you are breathing through the surface of the lake. The cool, weightless body of water flows into you, not to drink, but to remember. Ask, without words, "What do you remember about me?" At first, there's nothing. Then a change in the air, not wind exactly, more like a shift in pressure. Your skin prickles. Somewhere between the sound of cicadas and the breath in your own lungs, a hum appears. Low, patient, like something that has been waiting a very long time. It isn't the Pacific. It isn't a chant in an ancient temple. It's the same frequency, the same voice. Because Lemuria isn't just under the ocean, it's in every water that still listens. On the north shore of Oahu, a man named Kimo drums at sunset every Sunday, facing the sea. He says it isn't for the tourists, though they sometimes gather. It's for his grandmother, and for the island she told him about, a place called Mu. She said Mu was the first home. Kimo smiles, eyes on the horizon, that we're still hearing it in the wind between the waves. His drum is a shallow frame carved from koa wood, the skin stretched tight but worn smooth at the center. He doesn't play a melody, just a pattern, steady and deep. As the sun slides into the Pacific, the drumbeat folds into the sound of the tide. A fisherman passing by slows, tilts his head. 2 children chasing each other stop, suddenly quiet. Kimo nods toward the water. You hear that? That's not me. And for a moment, you can't tell where his rhythm ends and the ocean begins. Later, under the last light, he sets the drum beside him and simply listens. To play is to speak. To stop is to hear. Mu's still speaking. Most folks just forgot the language. These moments, on a dock in Minnesota, on the sands of Oahu, remind us that the call isn't about geography, it's about frequency. It can rise from a wave taller than your house or from a glass-still pond that only the loons visit. It can hide in a frame drum's echo or in the pause between your heartbeat and the next. The journey we're beginning isn't just about finding a lost continent. It's about restoring a way of hearing. Because if you can hear it in one place, you can carry it everywhere. So when you find your water, whatever shore, whatever lake, whatever rain-soaked gutter outside your window, stop. Listen. And if you feel that hum beneath the noise, you'll know you've already stepped onto the first shore. She started speaking less, touching hands more, humming under her breath. The night staff said the room felt different when she was on, like someone had opened a window you couldn't see. Sometimes remembering isn't about leaving. It's about bringing a lost frequency back into the life you already have. Let's be clear. This isn't a fantasy of running from bills and traffic to a beach hut and eternal sunset. Lemuria isn't an exit, it's a return. In the story that lives in many hearts, this civilization wasn't defined by borders or monuments. It was defined by how they lived, listening deeply to the land, the water, and each other. Harmony not as a photo, but as a practice. In a culture that rewards speed over stillness, profit over peace, volume over nuance, the Lemurian way is a radical question. What would happen if we led with the heart? What if connection, not control, was the organizing principle of a life? Across Polynesia, navigators tell of a mother island now beneath the waves. In Hawaiian chant, people speak of Mu, a homeland lost to the sea. Even in certain Native American oral histories, there are whispers of living far to the west, on lands the ocean later claimed. These are not claims for us to own. They are echoes, fragments of a memory too large to belong to any one story. Lemuria as a word is recent, but the feeling is old, shared, scattered, waiting. Why, in an age of satellites and instant answers, do so many dream of underwater temples they've never seen? Why do children draw crystal cities without anyone telling them the name? Why do ordinary people who don't care for mystical stuff feel a tug in the chest when the ocean speaks at night? Because the world is tilting again, and old frequencies rise when the brown shifts. This isn't nostalgia, it's activation. A reminder that the tools we need are the ones we misplaced. Empathy, intuition, a living bond with the earth. To some, Lemuria is geography. To others, it's genealogy, souls returning across lifetimes. But underneath labels is a simpler truth. We are remembering a way of being, a world in which you are not a role or a resume, not your worst day or your best headline, but a vast and ancient soul carrying the light of those who walked before you. The title card you saw at the start was not a motto. It was a mirror. Hold it up to yourself and watch what falls away. If you want to hear that other language the ocean speaks, try this. The next time you're near water, river, lake, sea, let the first 3 minutes belong to silence. Feel the salt, or the cool, or the mist. Notice your heartbeat. Then ask, without words, what do you remember about me? Not what do I remember about you? What do you remember about me? Listen for nothing. And in that nothing, a tone might find you. It won't give you a map. It will give you a direction, inward. Home is not what holds you. Home is what asks of you. If this story stirs something in you, good. Let it change how you walk. Let it soften how you speak. Let it make you dangerous to indifference. Bring the lost frequency into the room. Meetings, kitchens, hospital wards, classrooms, sidewalks. Make the air different when you arrive, not louder, kinder. There's a language under the language, a story under the story. If you hear it, you don't become someone else. You become who you were before the noise. In the chapters ahead, we'll trace the shoreline of this memory, where the word Lemuria came from, the hints scattered across cultures, and why a paradise could fade without being lost. But the journey doesn't start with maps. It starts with a listening. So when you stand near the water next time, Let the wind empty your thoughts. Let the salt bless your skin. Opening silent title card. Before the first towers, before the first kings, there was a land the ocean never forgot. Unknown. If you peel back the pages of time, not year by year, but in great sweeps, you pass the fall of Rome, the birth of agriculture, the first fire kindled by human hands. Keep going, past the time of cave paintings, past the time of ice and mammoth, until the continents themselves shift in your vision, until coastlines melt into new shapes. There, in the deep past, before history began to write itself, lay a continent we no longer see on any map. A place whose edges were kissed by waves from every direction. This was Lemuria, and though the name is modern, the memory is not. A world young, yet ancient. The earth was different then. The air was heavier with oxygen, the climate softer, and life, both human and not, moved in harmony with the cycles of the moon. Vast jungles swept from mountain to shore. Rivers shimmered with minerals, feeding plains that stretched farther than the eye could follow. The people of Lemuria lived in a state that is hard for us to picture today. They were not primitive, but neither were they obsessed with conquering the physical world. They built without scarring the land, healed without poisoning it, and learned without hoarding knowledge. They did not think of themselves as separate from the ocean. They believed they were its children. The language of light and tone. Lemurian speech, if it can even be called that, was not bound to words. They spoke in tones that carried more than meaning. They carried memory. A rising note could hold the joy of a birth, a falling tone the sorrow of parting. Conversations could be sung in colors the ear could almost see. Their music was not entertainment. It was the architecture of their cities. The walls, the streets, the gardens were built in resonance with certain notes, so that when wind passed through, it played a low, calming chord. To enter a Lemurian home was to step into a song. Micro Story 1: The Mother Island. The Polynesians have a story older than any colonial record about a great island to the west they call Hawaii. In this story, the people lived where the sea was always calm, where storms never came. The trees grew fruit as sweet as honey, and fish leapt willingly into the nets. One night, a star fell into the ocean, and the next morning the sea began to rise. The elders told their people to follow the birds. They would lead them to new lands. So the people set sail, but they looked back, and their island was gone. Not destroyed, not in flames, just gone, as if it had slipped beneath a sheet of glass. Today, anthropologists treat Hawaii as a symbolic homeland, a way to explain migration. But in whispers, among navigators and keepers of old songs, some still say, Hawaii was real, and it is waiting. Everyday life in Lemuria. Imagine walking through a Lemurian settlement. Houses are grown, not built, from living vines woven into arching frames, their leaves forming natural shade. Transparent crystal panes are set into the walls not as windows, but as amplifiers for sunlight. Inside, the floors are warm from the heat of the earth itself. Children learn to swim before they can walk, not for sport, but as a rite of connection to the ocean. At dawn, families gather in open circles on the beach. They face the rising sun, hands cupped to hold the light as if it were water, then pour it gently into the sea. This is their way of greeting both sky and ocean. The day is measured not by hours, but by the position of the sun and the changing colors of the water. Meals are shared communally. No one eats alone, unless in meditation. The elders and the star maps. In the highest hills, elders keep the sky circles, rings of stones set to mark the rising of certain stars. These are not for navigation alone, but for remembrance. The Lemurians believed their ancestors came from the Pleiades, and once a year, when those stars rose directly above the sky circles, they would hold the return ceremony. No words were spoken, only tones. The people believed the stars could hear the vibration of their gratitude. These sky circles, now buried under ocean or forest, may still stand. Perhaps one day they will be found again. A different kind of power. Unlike Atlantis, whose legacy would be tied to crystal energy weaponry and grand architecture, Lemuria's strength lay in subtlety. They harnessed the piezoelectric properties of their crystal-rich soil to power healing chambers and resonating pools. A visitor might see a simple pool of water ringed by stones, but step inside and the water would hum. Wounds closed faster. Dreams became vivid. People emerged with clarity in their eyes. Science today cannot replicate it, because it was not technology alone. It was relationship. Microstory 2. Rapa Nui. In 1964, a school teacher named Mateo from mainland Chile took a position on Rapa Nui, what outsiders call Easter Island. He had never heard of Lemuria. But on his first night, he dreamed he was standing on a vast shore, the ocean stretching endlessly in all directions. In the dream, a woman in white placed a carved stone in his hands. "You have been here before," she told him. When he woke, his hands ached as if he had gripped something heavy all night. Years later, while exploring a coastal cave, Mateo found petroglyphs of a star map carved into the rock. One cluster matched the Pleiades, and in the corner of the carving was a symbol he recognized instantly from his dream. The foreshadowing of Atlantis. Though Lemuria and Atlantis would one day overlap in time, their destinies were set on different courses from the start. Lemuria taught unity. Atlantis sought dominion. Lemuria worked in harmony with the earth. Atlantis experimented on it. When they eventually met, it was not as friends, and though both would fall, the world would remember Atlantis in legend and Lemuria in whispers. The symbol that survived. Across Polynesia, in petroglyphs and woven patterns, a spiral within a circle appears again and again. To scholars, it is a decorative motif. To those who still keep the old ways, it is the first shore, the place where spirit first stepped onto earth.
It is said that if you find this pattern carved into stone near the ocean, you are standing where Lemuria touched the surface world.
The invitation. Lemuria is not simply a lost land. It is a mirror. It asks us, do you remember how to live before the noise? When you walk by the sea and the wind changes, when you hear a tone that vibrates in your bones, when you dream of an ocean that is not on any map, you are hearing the call of the land before Atlantis. And somewhere, beneath thousands of miles of salt water, the ocean is still singing your name. In the next chapter, we follow the currents of this memory to the scattered islands, the hidden stones, and the secret songs that may be the last breadcrumbs leading us to where Lemuria once rose from the deep. Because before we can understand how it was lost, we must learn how it lived. The ocean does not forget. It only waits for you to remember. Anonymous. The sea as an archive. Most of us think of memory as something kept inside the mind, fragile, personal, easy to lose. But the ancients saw it differently. They believed memory was not just in the brain, it was in the water, in the stones, in the wind itself. And if that is true, then the ocean is the largest archive on Earth. What if every wave lapping the shore carries a fragment of a story older than humanity itself? What if the tides are not only pulled by the moon, but by the weight of the memories they hold? The currents are not just moving water, they are moving time. Echoes in the Pacific. In certain parts of the Pacific, divers tell of hearing low tones under the water, sounds with no clear source, like a song being sung miles away. Scientists call them bloop events or submarine seismic activity. But for the people who still hold the old traditions, these tones are the voices of the ancestors echoing through the deep. These tones are not random. They follow patterns, rising at dusk, fading at dawn. In Lemurian belief, the ocean could speak to those who were still attuned, and those who listened long enough could follow the sound, like a breadcrumb trail, to places where the land once stood. Micro-story 1. The Glass Beach. In 1987, a marine biologist named Claire was doing a survey off the coast of Kauai when she found a small inlet filled with polished glass, green, blue, and milky white. She assumed it was just debris worn smooth by the waves. But when she picked one up, she saw tiny carvings, not made by any modern tool, etched into the surface. Spirals, star clusters, and lines that seemed to form a map. Local elders told her that such glass was not trash. It was lani ikaika, sky-strong stones, brought by the waves from a time when the land was whole. Claire took a single piece home. For years, she kept it on her desk. One night, she dreamed of standing in a circle of stone, the ocean stretched out before her, the glass glowing in her hand.
When she woke, the peace was warm to the touch. The science of resonance. Modern science now admits something ancient cultures always knew. Water remembers. Experiments have shown that water molecules can retain patterns of electromagnetic influence even after the initial cause is gone. If that is true, then the water in our bodies, 65% of our total mass, could carry impressions far older than our personal lifetimes. The Lemurians believed that when you swam in certain sacred pools, the water downloaded memories into your body. You might leave with visions of a life you never lived, or perhaps a life you had simply forgotten. Listening practice, shoreline exercise. Find a quiet shoreline. Or, if you cannot, sit somewhere you can hear the sound of water, waves, a fountain, even recorded ocean sounds. Close your eyes. Imagine each wave as a page in a book, turning in slow motion. Listen not for the crash, but for the pause between waves. In that pause, imagine a voice, not in words, but in tone, rising to meet you. Let it fill the space between your heartbeats. This is how the Lemurians read the ocean, not with their eyes, but with their whole body. The carriers of memory. When Lemuria fell, its survivors scattered. Some found their way to the highlands of South America, others to the atolls of Micronesia, still others to the volcanic peaks of what is now Hawaii. They carried with them not gold or weapons, but songs. Each song was a vessel, a way to fold an entire chapter of history into rhythm and melody. You couldn't read it on paper, but sing it, and the land itself seemed to respond. In Rapa Nui, there is a chant known as the Song of Stones, said to be so old that even the meaning of its words has been forgotten. Yet when it is sung at certain cliffs, rocks loosen and fall as if pushed by an unseen hand. Micro-story 2. The Man Who Could Hear Islands. In 2003, a fisherman from Fiji named Penny claimed he could hear islands underwater. When asked to prove it, he took researchers in a small boat far from the known reefs. He stopped, closed his eyes, and pointed, "There is land below." They laughed, until sonar confirmed a massive seamount rising from the ocean floor, capped with terraces that could not have formed naturally. When they asked how he knew, Penny shrugged. "It sings different here."
Atlantis enters the current. By the time Atlantis rose to power, Lemuria was already a memory carried on the waves. But Atlantis learned quickly that these oceanic records could be tapped, mined for knowledge. They built resonance chambers designed to pull specific memories from water, translating them into visions. It was part science, part art, and part theft. In doing so, Atlantis inherited both the wisdom and the warnings of Lemuria. But as history shows, they chose power over harmony. The warning in the water. All across the Pacific, there are similar warnings hidden in old songs. If you forget the ocean's name, the ocean will remember yours. To the Lemurians, this meant that losing connection to the source would invite the source to reclaim you. It was not a threat, but a reminder. Respect the currents, or you will be carried away by them. Some say that is exactly what happened to Atlantis. Listening practice 2. Still water memory. If you cannot travel to the sea, find a still body of water, a lake, a pond, even a bowl filled to the brim. Sit before it at dawn or dusk. Do not focus on the reflections. Focus on the tiny, nearly invisible ripples. Place your fingertips lightly on the surface, just enough to feel the water's coolness. Close your eyes and imagine that beneath your skin, the water in your body is recognizing its twin in front of you. Breathe slowly. On each inhale, imagine drawing in a memory you have never lived. On each exhale, imagine returning something forgotten back to the water. The Lemurians believed that such exchanges were the truest conversations, ones in which no words are spoken, but everything is understood. Why this matters now? In our world of satellites and instant communication, we think we have outgrown the old ways. But the ocean still holds our history, and perhaps our future. Climate change is melting ice that has been frozen for millennia. What memories will be released into the water? What ancient currents of memory will begin to flow again? Perhaps that is why so many are dreaming of islands they have never visited, hearing songs they have never learned. The ocean is speaking again. To follow these currents is to risk being pulled somewhere you cannot explain. But if you listen long enough, they may carry you to the very threshold of what came after Lemuria and into the heart of the Atlantean age. Because memories are not just echoes of the past. They are invitations. Every civilization leaves a doorway. Not all of them are meant to be opened. Unknown. The gates between worlds. If the ocean is an archive, then somewhere within it must be doors, thresholds where one reality leans into another. The ancients didn't imagine these places as destinations on a map. They were described instead as states of being, moments when the sea itself shifted character. Sailors would speak of crossing into waters where the current pooled without wind, where the sunlight bent unnaturally, and where the air took on a taste like iron and salt combined. In such places, time seemed to loosen its grip. The horizon would shimmer like heat over desert stone, and the sky, somehow, felt closer, as if the world itself had tilted. In Polynesian tradition, these passages were called Ngā Moana, the sea's windows. Elders taught that they were transits, not through physical distance, but through the boundaries of perception itself. Step through, and the waking world would blur into the realm of the ancestors. The Lemurians knew them as the sunken gates, monolithic oceanic structures positioned along deep energy lines, locked to the movement of both the stars above and the unseen currents below. These gates were not random. They were engineered alignments, designed to open only when the celestial and tidal rhythms matched their original encoding. The survivor's map. When Lemuria fell beneath the waves, its survivors carried no parchment maps. Salt water devours paper.
Instead, they carried their navigational charts in their songs, chants, and star paths, patterns memorized over generations. One chant, still alive in parts of Samoa, cryptically speaks of 4 gates in the east, 3 in the west, and 1 beneath the shadow of the moon. Modern scholars interpret this as metaphor, but traditional navigators hear it differently. The shadow of the moon could mark a location in the Central Pacific, a volcanic ridge long submerged, halfway between Hawaii and the Marquesas. In 2007, a joint U.S.-Japanese sonar mapping expedition revealed symmetrical terraced formations on that ridge. The patterns were so precise that one oceanographer, off-camera, admitted, "Either this is a miracle of geology or someone built it a very long time ago." Micro Story 1. The Diver at Kepuhi. In the summer of 1996, Jonah, a free diver from Molokai, swam beyond the usual fishing range near Kepuhi Beach. The current that day was unlike anything he had felt before. It pulled him outward, yet with a strange steadiness, like a conveyor belt of water. At 80 feet down, the sand gave way to an immense stone arch. The surface was polished, the angles exact. Through it, he claimed he saw light, not the fractured dance of sunlight through waves, but a golden, unwavering glow. Drawn forward, he felt a sudden, crushing pressure in his chest. Then came the sound, a vibration more than a noise, like thousands of voices holding the same note. The hum resonated inside his bones. When he woke, he was back on the beach, the afternoon sun dipping low. And on his chest, just above the heart, was a perfect, pale circle of skin, untouched by the sun. Atlantis and the appropriation of gates. By the time Atlantis rose from myth into dominance, Lemuria was already gone, its history surviving only in fractured memory, scattered relics, and the whispers of the ocean itself. The Atlanteans, masters of resonance technology, quickly learned that the sunken gates were not symbolic, they were functional. Each gate was an interface, a precise alignment where physical location met energetic geometry. By tuning massive beacon towers on nearby islands to match the gate's frequency, they could lock it open or seal it shut. But the Atlanteans did not treat the gates as sacred. They treated them as assets, control points in a network of power. Some gates were restricted to the ruling elite. Others were closed entirely. Their resonance shifted to disorient or even sink enemy ships. The ocean was no longer a free archive. It had become an empire's vault.
Listening practice. The door beneath the waves. If you are near the ocean, find a point where the tide runs strongest. If you are inland, imagine it. Close your eyes. Picture a stone arch beneath the water, older than any recorded history. Watch how the light bends as it passes through. Now imagine lowering your hand into the sea just above the arch. Feel the faint pulse, not a wave, not a current, but something deeper, like the vibration of a distant drum. Breathe in, not as if you're taking air, but as if you're inhaling time itself. With each exhale, feel the boundary between you and the water dissolve. Stay here for 3 slow breaths, Then open your eyes. This is how the Lemurian navigators claimed they could find the gates, not by sight, but by feeling the water remember itself. Micro Story 2: The Gatekeeper's Song. In the Marquesas, there is a lullaby almost no one outside the islands knows. Tepesi ate kaitiaki, the Song of the Keeper. It speaks of a solitary guardian who sits at the threshold of a great gate beneath the sea, singing to keep it closed until the right travelers arrive. In 2011, a French acoustic research vessel recorded a harmonic tone in the deep channels of the Marquesas that repeated every 19 minutes for 4 days straight. The researchers could find no mechanical source. When they played the recording to a local elder, she listened quietly, then smiled. "That is the gatekeeper. You must have come close." The ritual of passage. Ancient accounts suggest that crossing a sunken gate was not a casual act. It required preparation. Lemurian navigators would fast for 3 days, then enter the water carrying a small carved sphere of basalt etched with spirals. The sphere, they believed, resonated with the gate's frequency. Approaching the gate, they would hum a single note in unison. Once inside the arch's threshold, they claimed to feel a change in the density of the water, thicker, almost like passing through oil. Some described seeing flashes of other landscapes, mountains that no longer existed, skies with unfamiliar constellations, and cities gleaming under twin suns. Whether these were visions, memories, or something else entirely, no one could say.
Every civilization leaves a doorway. Not all of them are meant to be opened. Unknown. The gates between worlds. If the ocean is an archive, then somewhere within it must be doors, thresholds where one reality leans into another. The ancients didn't imagine these places as destinations on a map. They were described instead as states of being, moments when the sea itself shifted character. Sailors would speak of crossing into waters where the current pooled without wind, where the sunlight bent unnaturally, and where the air took on a taste like iron and salt combined. In such places, time seemed to loosen its grip. The horizon would shimmer like heat over desert stone, and the sky, somehow, felt closer, as if the world itself had tilted. In Polynesian tradition, these passages were called Ngamatapihi Moana, the sea's windows. Elders taught that they were transits, not through physical distance, but through the boundaries of perception itself. Step through, and the waking world would blur into the realm of the ancestors. The Lemurians knew them as the sunken gates, monolithic oceanic structures positioned along deep energy lines, locked to the movement of both the stars above and the unseen currents below. These gates were not random. They were engineered alignments, designed to open only when the celestial and tidal rhythms matched their original encoding. The survivor's map. When Lemuria fell beneath the waves, its survivors carried no parchment maps. Saltwater devours paper. Instead, they carried their navigational charts in their songs, chants, and star paths. patterns memorized over generations. One chant, still alive in parts of Samoa, cryptically speaks of 4 gates in the east, 3 in the west, and 1 beneath the shadow of the moon. Modern scholars interpret this as metaphor, but traditional navigators hear it differently. The shadow of the moon could mark a location in the Central Pacific, a volcanic ridge long submerged, halfway between Hawaii and the Marquesas. In 2007, a joint U.S.-Japanese sonar mapping expedition revealed symmetrical terraced formations on that ridge. The patterns were so precise that one oceanographer, off-camera, admitted, "Either this is a miracle of geology or someone built it a very long time ago." Micro Story 1. The Diver at Kepuhi. In the summer of 1996, Jonah, a free diver from Molokai, swam beyond the usual fishing range near Kepuhi Beach. The current that day was unlike anything he had felt before. It pulled him outward, yet with a strange steadiness, like a conveyor belt of water. At 80 feet down, the sand gave way to an immense stone arch. The surface was polished, the angles exact. Through it, he claimed he saw light, not the fractured dance of sunlight through waves, but a golden, unwavering glow. Drawn forward, he felt a sudden, crushing pressure in his chest. Then came the sound, a vibration more than a noise, like thousands of voices holding the same note. The hum resonated inside his bones. When he woke, he was back on the beach, the afternoon sun dipping low. And on his chest, just above the heart, was a perfect, pale circle of skin, untouched by the sun. Atlantis and the appropriation of gates. By the time Atlantis rose from myth into dominance, Lemuria was already gone, its history surviving only in fractured memory, scattered relics, and the whispers of the ocean itself. The Atlanteans, masters of resonance technology, quickly learned that the sunken gates were not symbolic, they were functional. Each gate was an interface, a precise alignment where physical location met energetic geometry. By tuning massive beacon towers on nearby islands to match the gate's frequency, they could lock it open or seal it shut. But the Atlanteans did not treat the gates as sacred. They treated them as assets, control points in a network of power. Some gates were restricted to the ruling elite. Others were closed entirely. Their resonance shifted to disorient or even sink enemy ships. The ocean was no longer a free archive. It had become an empire's vault.
Listening practice. The door beneath the waves. If you are near the ocean, find a point where the tide runs strongest. If you are inland, imagine it. Close your eyes. Picture a stone arch beneath the water, older than any recorded history. Watch how the light bends as it passes through. Now imagine lowering your hand into the sea just above the arch. Feel the faint pulse, not a wave, not a current, but something deeper, like the vibration of a distant drum. Breathe in, not as if you're taking air, but as if you're inhaling time itself. With each exhale, feel the boundary between you and the water dissolve. Stay here for 3 slow breaths, then open your eyes.
This is how the Lemurian navigators claimed they could find the gates, not by sight, but by feeling the water remember itself. Micro Story 2: The Gatekeeper's Song. In the Marquesas, there is a lullaby almost no one outside the islands knows. Tepesi ate kaitiaki, the Song of the Keeper. It speaks of a solitary guardian who sits at the threshold of a great gate beneath the sea, singing to keep it closed until the right travelers arrive. In 2011, a French acoustic research vessel recorded a harmonic tone in the deep channels of the Marquesas that repeated every 19 minutes for 4 days straight. The researchers could find no mechanical source. When they played the recording to a local elder, she listened quietly, then smiled. "That is the gatekeeper. You must have come close." The ritual of passage. Ancient accounts suggest that crossing a sunken gate was not a casual act. It required preparation. Lemurian navigators would fast for 3 days, then enter the water carrying a small carved sphere of basalt etched with spirals. The sphere, they believed, resonated with the gate's frequency. Approaching the gate, they would hum a single note in unison. Once inside the arch's threshold, they claimed to feel a change in the density of the water, thicker, almost like passing through oil. Some described seeing flashes of other landscapes, mountains that no longer existed, skies with unfamiliar constellations, and cities gleaming under twin suns. Whether these were visions, memories, or something else entirely, no one could say.
The temptation of opening. Every culture that remembers the gates also carries the same warning. Not all doors should be opened. But human curiosity, whether in the age of stone or the height of Atlantis, has never been easily contained. The sunken gates offered a temptation beyond gold or conquest, unfiltered access to knowledge unbound by time. To stand before one and listen was to hear not only the voices of the past, but the possibilities of the future. And if legend is to be believed, it was at one such gate that the first prophecy of Atlantis' own fall was heard and ignored. Micro Story 3: The Scientist Who Stayed Too Long. In 1984, Dr. Helen Navarro, a physical oceanographer from California, led a private expedition to study deep water currents near the Azores. Her team detected an anomalous thermal column rising from the seabed in a perfectly vertical shaft. Navarro descended in a submersible to investigate. At 1,200 feet, she radioed in that she saw a massive stone circle wider than a football field, inscribed with concentric grooves. Then, silence. 27 minutes later, she resurfaced alone. She had no memory of how she returned, only one single phrase she kept repeating in Portuguese. "It's not ready to open." She resigned from academia within the year. Why this matters now. In our modern world, the gates might not be as dormant as we believe. Unexplained whirlpools, rogue waves, and strange sonar anomalies have increased in areas tied to these ancient myths. The magnetic fields around some submerged ridges are shifting in ways that baffle marine geophysicists.
If the currents are changing, the gates may already be stirring. And history has shown, twice, that ignoring such movements carries a cost. To step through a gate is to surrender to its current, and currents, once entered, do not care if you are ready. The next chapter will carry us into the very heart of the Atlantean design, where resonance became a weapon, and the sea's memory was bent to serve an empire. The same song that can heal can also unmake. Inheritance of power. When Atlantis first learned of the sunken gates, they did not approach them with the reverence of the Lemurian navigators. To the Lemurians, resonance was a conversation, a tuning between human, earth, and sea. To Atlantis, it became an instrument of control. Their scholars studied the gates not for their spiritual significance, but for their mechanics. By building great resonance towers, crystalline spires etched with harmonic channels, they could project frequencies far enough to manipulate the gates from hundreds of miles away. Where Lemurian song coaxed the gates open slowly, like a flower turning toward the sun, the Atlantean method forced them. Energy surged unnaturally fast, currents reversed, the ocean itself seemed to shudder. At first, this mastery felt like triumph. Then it became policy. The strategic network. By 500 years into their dominance, Atlantis had identified and catalogued 17 sunken gates across the globe. Each one was assigned a frequency signature, a harmonic key that could open, close, or destabilize it. They built a resonance map, not on parchment, but in light. Suspended in the grand hall of the council, the map shimmered like a living constellation. With a single adjustment, they could lock an entire oceanic trade route or strand an enemy fleet in still water. Control the gates, they realized, and you controlled the flow of knowledge, resources, and people. The ocean was no longer a frontier. It was a chessboard. Microstory 1. The Siege of the Silver Fleet. The Kingdom of Alta, a maritime ally of Atlantis, rebelled after a dispute over tribute. Their silver fleet, 43 ships strong, set sail to cut trade routes to the Atlantean capital. From the resonance tower at Cape Sola, Atlantean operators targeted the Midway Gate, the fleet's planned crossing point. Witnesses on nearby islands reported the sea flattening into an unnatural calm. Then came the sound, a deep, metallic hum that seemed to come from below the ships. Minutes later, the water erupted in columns, snapping masts like twigs. Not a single vessel reached its destination. The survivors spoke of a door closing beneath them, sucking the ocean down into itself. The shift from exploration to control. The Atlantean cultural mindset shifted in those centuries. Whereas once the gates might have been a shared inheritance of all seafaring peoples, they were now state secrets. Resonance was no longer taught openly. Children were not allowed to sing the old navigational chants without permission. And while Lemurian tradition had trained navigators to listen, the Atlanteans trained technicians to command. This difference was more than philosophical. It altered the very relationship between humans and the sea. The Lemurians saw themselves as guests. The Atlanteans acted as landlords. Listening practice. The pulse of command. Designed to highlight the difference between Lemurian listening and Atlantean control. Close your eyes. Imagine standing at the base of a crystal tower taller than any mountain you've ever seen. Its sides hum faintly, the air around it charged like the moment before a lightning strike. Now, instead of harmonizing with it, imagine overpowering it, matching its hum, and then forcing it higher, sharper, until the tower itself shifts color. Notice what that feels like. The tension, the strain, the way the environment seems to hold its breath. This was the Atlantean way. Not to join the song of the earth, but to make it sing on their terms. Microstory 2. The Architect's Warning. Kallion, the chief designer of the third-generation resonance towers, was a quiet man. He believed in precision, but he also understood balance. In his journals, later found preserved in volcanic ash, he warned, "The gates are not doors in the way we think of them. They are lungs. Force them to breathe too fast, and the body they belong to will choke." His warnings were ignored. The council doubled tower output. Kallion resigned, retreating to an island where, according to legend, he dismantled a minor gate stone by stone to prevent it from ever being misused.
Weaponizing weather. Once the Atlanteans learned that resonance could alter not just currents, but pressure systems, their ambitions reached the skies. By subtly shifting the frequency at key gates, they could direct warm or cold water flows, influencing storm formation. To friends, this meant protection. Hurricanes dispersed, droughts eased. To enemies, it meant engineered disasters, fleets scattered by natural storms, harvests ruined by unseasonal winds. The Lemurians had whispered that the gates could call the rain. The Atlanteans turned that whisper into thunder. Microstory 3. The Forbidden Experiment. One record, heavily damaged but still partially legible, speaks of a secret Atlantean experiment to open 3 gates at once. The intent was to create a resonance corridor linking the Indian Ocean to the Caribbean in under a day's sail. The attempt began well. The gates aligned, current surged, but then a feedback loop formed. The energies between the gates amplified one another uncontrollably. The corridor collapsed in a shock wave, felt as far as the Nile Delta. Several islands simply vanished beneath the waves. The council called it an unfortunate accident of nature. No one outside the capital believed them. Listening practice. The edge of the storm. Sit comfortably. Imagine you are on the deck of a ship, the sea rolling gently beneath you. In the distance, you see a line where the sky darkens, a wall of storm. Now, imagine hearing a hum beneath the wind. It matches the pitch of the waves. Slowly, it rises, and with it, the clouds begin to spiral faster. Breathe in with the rising pitch. Breathe out with the rolling thunder. Understand in your bones how easily awe can be turned into fear. The ethical divide. Within Atlantis itself, not everyone agreed with the council's use of the gates.
A small sect, calling themselves the Circle of Still Waters, believed the gates should be returned to their natural states. They began sabotaging towers, erasing frequency maps, and teaching forbidden Lemurian songs to coastal villages. To the council, they were traitors. To the ocean, perhaps, they were stewards. History does not record which side the sea favored, only that within 2 generations both the Circle and the Council were gone.
Micro-story 4. The Last Saboteur. Legend tells of Nerine, a woman of mixed Lemurian and Atlantean descent, who infiltrated the largest resonance tower in the West. On the night of the midsummer alignment, she climbed to its peak and struck a single crystal plate with a tuning hammer carved from bone. The tower's hum dropped instantly, as if exhaling for the first time in centuries. The nearest sunken gate, locked for over 400 years, opened without command. Witnesses say Nerine dove into the water and swam toward the gate. She never returned. Some say she chose to live on the other side. Why this matters now? In the modern era, we think of power in terms of technology, satellites, missiles, algorithms. But the Atlanteans remind us that control over the environment itself is the oldest form of supremacy. And if the gates are indeed stirring again, we may face the same temptation they did: to use the song of the earth not to heal, but to rule. Every empire believes it can master the forces it commands. But mastery is an illusion. In the next chapter, we will follow the first signs that Atlantis' control over the gates was beginning to fray, not from an outside enemy, but from the ocean itself. When the sea goes silent, it is not at peace. It is listening, old Lemurian saying. The day the sea went still. It began without warning. One morning, the harbors were quiet, not just from the absence of wind, but from the absence of movement. Waves that had always lapped gently at the docks stood frozen, as if the ocean had become glass. Sailors who had spent their entire lives on water could not recall such stillness. Nets hung limp. Seabirds circled but did not call out. The air smelled faintly metallic, like the moment before lightning strikes. Micro-story 1. The boy on the jetty. A boy named Halem stood at the edge of a weathered jetty in the fishing district. He had grown up with the sound of waves as his lullaby, but now the silence pressed into his ears so heavily it made him dizzy. He threw a pebble into the water. Instead of the usual ripples, the surface swallowed it without a sound. No splash, no circles, only the faintest shimmer. Halem ran to his mother, breathless. She brushed it off as just the tide. But that night, the boy dreamed of standing on the same jetty, watching the horizon swell upward like a wall. Echoes beneath the calm. Divers sent to investigate found something stranger still. The gates themselves were humming, but at a frequency too low for the human ear. Coral near the structures vibrated gently, dislodging silt that drifted upward in long silver ribbons.
One diver described it as hearing with your bones. Another claimed that in the silence of the water he could make out words. He would not repeat what they said. Listening practice. The pause before the drum. Sit in a quiet room. Imagine a drum beat you heard for as long as you can remember, steady, reassuring. Now imagine it stops. Hold yourself in that stillness. Feel the urge to lean forward, to strain for the next beat. That was how Atlantis felt, suspended between breaths, knowing something was coming, but unable to name it. Micro-story 2. The Oracle of White Sand. Far south, on an island where the sand glowed faintly under moonlight, an oracle named Sarai walked the shore. She had not slept in days. The silence of the sea was louder than any storm to her. She knelt, pressed her ear to the sand, and heard the deep roll of something vast turning over in its sleep. Her prophecy, recorded on shell tablets, was short. The wave is already on its way. We are only waiting to meet it. The council dismissed her warning. The circle of still waters began to prepare. The disappearance of wind. For 3 weeks, no wind touched the sails of Atlantean ships. Farmers complained of heat without relief. Birds migrated inland in flocks so thick they blotted out the sun for minutes at a time. In the capital, the great flame atop the tower of Archaeology burned straight upward, unshaken, a sight that made priests uneasy. Micro-story 3. The Stonemason's Dream. A stonemason named Dreven, working on the repair of an inland gate, dreamed of carving a doorway that opened into the sky. Through it, he saw a single wave, taller than mountains, moving impossibly slow, as if the world itself had shifted into another rhythm. When he awoke, his hands were wet with seawater, though his home was miles from the coast. The disappearance of sound. It wasn't just the sea. Entire sections of the city began to feel muted. Marketplaces were quieter, even with the same number of people. Hammer strikes rang dull against stone. Chants in the temple seemed to sink into the floor instead of rising toward the dome. Musicians noticed their instruments sounded emptier, as if the air no longer carried their notes fully. The old Lemurian navigators knew this too. When the sea's song changes, it carries the land with it.
Listening practice, the hollow note. Close your eyes. Clap your hands once. Listen to the echo fade. Now imagine that echo ending faster than it should, cut short by something that swallows sound. That is the hollowness Atlantis began to feel, not just an absence, but the presence of something removing sound. Micro-story 4. The Silent Harbor. In the Western Harbor, a fleet prepared to sail despite the warnings. Merchants had grown restless from lost trade. As the ships pushed out, the water ahead of them went completely black, like ink poured into the sea. No one knows what they saw within it, but the ships turned back within an hour, their sails limp, their crews pale and unwilling to speak. The harbor stayed empty for the rest of the season. The gates hold their breath. The resonance map,
once alive with shifting lights, froze. Every gate glowed steadily, without fluctuation. It was as if they were all locked into the same state, holding the same tone. Technicians celebrated the perfect stability. Elders called it the holding of breath before the scream. Micro-story 5, the inland lake. Hundreds of miles from the sea, a small inland lake in the heart of the Midwestern plains lay still under a silver dawn. A traveler camped nearby rose early and walked to the shore. He noticed the water mirrored the sky too perfectly, not a ripple, not even where he tossed a stick. Then, faintly, a pulse began beneath his feet. Later, he would say the lake was listening to something far away. Weeks later, that lake would drain overnight into an underground cavern. A civilization on edge. Markets slowed. Temples were fuller than ever before. People lit lamps in their windows at night, as if the extra light could hold back whatever was gathering in the dark. And yet, there was beauty in the stillness. Painters captured the mirror-like sea. Lovers walked the docks without fear of sudden rain. For a brief moment, Atlantis was a city holding hands with its own fate, waiting for the grip to tighten.
The last festival. The council, perhaps sensing the fear, declared a festival, the Feast of Tides, to reassure the people. Musicians played, dancers moved through the streets, and lanterns floated into the still night air. But as the festival reached its peak, every lantern in the sky tilted in the same direction, toward the sea. The crowd grew quiet. Even the laughter died in their throats. The horizon shifts. One night, from the highest balcony of the Tower of Eralis, an astronomer noticed the horizon was no longer perfectly level. It was subtle, like the slow tilting of a great bowl. When she reported it, the council dismissed her until the same tilt appeared on navigators' charts from across the empire. Microstory 6. The bird that wouldn't land. On the island of Oahu, far from Atlantis's capital, a fisherman named Kaleo noticed a single seabird circling above his boat for hours. It refused to land even when exhausted. When he called to it, it gave one low, mournful cry, then flew straight out to sea, never to return. That night, the sea around Oahu glowed faintly blue, as if lit from below. The silence breaks. It happened at dawn. A single, low note, so deep it rattled the teeth, rolled through every harbor, every street, every inland valley. Dogs howled, children cried. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. But in the harbors, the water had begun to move again, not in waves, but in a slow, gathering swell, as if the entire ocean had turned toward the land. The long silence had been a mercy, a final moment to remember the world as it was. But mercy always ends. In the next chapter, the wave comes, and Atlantis learns what it means when the gates stop listening altogether.
The end of the world does not arrive with haste. It comes like a tide, pulling you backward before it swallows you whole. The first sound. It was not thunder. It was lower, heavier, like the groan of the earth itself. People felt it before they heard it, in the soles of their feet, in the spaces between their ribs. Windows trembled. Water in clay jars shivered. On the western cliffs, shepherds saw the horizon rise as if the ocean had grown a spine. Micro-story 1. The Weaver at the Loom. In the quiet weaving quarter, a woman named Avena was working the shuttle back and forth when the sound came. Her loom skipped, threads snapping in a neat diagonal line. She would never finish that tapestry, not because she died, but because the pattern she had been weaving appeared in the clouds above the wave hours later. The Wall of Water. From the watchtowers, guards saw it first. A line across the horizon, dark against the pale morning light. At first, they thought it was a storm front, but storms moved with wind, and this thing moved with purpose. It grew taller with every breath. Soon it blotted out the sky behind it. Birds flew inland in frenzied arcs. Somewhere, a temple bell rang 3 times and stopped. The decision of the council. In the high hall, the council argued. Flee inland or open the gates in a final attempt to disperse the force. The resonance map was no longer glowing. It was burning, every point of light flaring white-hot. Elder Martus spoke the words no one wanted to hear. The gates will not hold. We can only choose where to meet the water. Micro-story 2. The Boy and the Bronze Fish. Down at the docks, young Halim, the boy from the silent jetty, held a bronze fish charm given to him by his grandfather. He had been told it would point toward home if ever he was lost at sea. When he dropped it into a shallow pool by the dock, it spun slowly, not toward the city, but toward the oncoming wave. The wave breathes in. Before a wave strikes, the sea pulls back. That's when people truly understood the scale of what was coming. The harbor floor appeared, slick with seaweed and studded with ancient anchors that no one remembered losing. Fish flopped helplessly in the sudden shallows. Children ran to collect them. Mothers screamed for them to come back. The air was suddenly hotter, as if the sun had moved closer. Listening practice. The inhale before impact. Close your eyes. Picture the ocean as a living creature. Feel it take a deep breath, pulling everything toward it. Notice what that does to your own breath, how you want to hold it, waiting. That's what the Atlantis felt, the unbearable pause before the strike. The first impact. When it hit the outer reefs, the sound was like glass shattering on a planetary scale. Spray shot higher than the tallest towers, catching the morning light in a halo of silver. Those on the high cliffs saw the city's shadow swallowed in seconds. Micro-story 3. The Twin Divers. 2 brothers, Rollo and Varen, had been repairing an underwater arch when the sea began to move unnaturally. They swam upward, thinking they would break the surface into safety. Instead, they rose into the belly of the wave itself, seeing the city distorted through a wall of water before they were carried over the rooftops and lost to the inland flood.
The gate's final song. In the capital, the gates activated without command. Their pillars vibrated so violently that dust fell from the ceilings of surrounding temples. The sound they made was not the harmonious chord the people were used to. It was a single resonant note that shook every bone in the body. Some claimed it was a farewell. Others swore it was a warning meant for someone far away. Microstory 4. The Old Sailor and the Rope. On the farthest pier, an old sailor named Grevin tied himself to a mooring post with the strongest rope he owned. He said, "If the sea wants me, it'll have to take the whole pier too." When the wave came, the pier vanished, but Grevin was found days later in a tree, still tied to the rope, muttering about a door in the water. The city tilts. The force of the water pushed the entire western quarter upward before crushing it down. Streets became rivers, statues toppled, floating away like driftwood. The Tower of Archaeology held for 7 minutes before its top half sheared away, carried inland like a spear of white stone.
Microstory 5. The Candle in the Temple. In the Temple of Still Waters, a single ceremonial candle remained lit through the first strike. Witnesses swore the flame bent toward the wave as if bowing. When the water finally reached the altar, the flame went out without smoke. The inland rush. The wave did not break and retreat. It kept coming, rolling across farmland, devouring forests, filling valleys until they became lakes in minutes. Villages hundreds of miles from the coast saw the sea arrive at their doorsteps. People climbed trees, rooftops, and even the statues of old kings. Some survived, many did not. Listening practice. The sound of weight. Sit still. Imagine a sound so heavy it has mass. A sound that presses on your chest, pins you in place. Let yourself feel the immensity of it. That's what the survivors remembered most. Not the sight of the wave, but the crushing sound of its body moving against the world. Microstory 6. The Horse that Ran to the Sea. On a hill above the flooding plain, a black horse broke free from its tether and ran, not away from the water, but toward it. Those who saw it claimed it was following a sound only it could hear. When the wave reached the hill, the horse disappeared into the spray. Days later, hoofprints were found on a distant, untouched island. The last light. As the sun climbed higher, the sea reflected it in fragments, each wave crest becoming a shard of blinding gold. Survivors later said it was beautiful even as it destroyed them. Some swore they saw figures in the water, moving not against the current, but with it, as if guiding it. The vanishing. By nightfall, Atlantis was no longer visible from the cliffs. The ocean had claimed it entirely, leaving only floating debris and the faint glow of the gates deep below, fading like embers. What remains of Atlantis is not just stone and memory, but a question, whispered in every culture that dreams of lost cities. If the wave came again, would we listen this time?